title of my presentation, Consultant Work Without Unlearning Another Language. This is part of my very unusual perspective, how I got into field linguistics and language documentation, which is has been influenced by work on heavily endangered and even moribund languages. Two of the three languages which you see here, Forest Ennets and Ume-Sami, are moribund. Ume-Sami is only remembered, Forest Ennets is still spoken by a couple of speakers, unless as long as a linguist is around. If the linguist is gone, then the language is no longer spoken. But in the last years, a number of critical consultants have died because of high age. I have done, for the first time in my life, a kind of critical retrospective on my fieldwork, which I have published in 2018, which is based on a conference presentation, Reflections on Linguistic Fieldwork with the moribund speech communities, which gives you most of the background I won't be able to talk about. Because today I'm not talking about my work on Ennets and Ume-Sami or on Dolgan. I'm talking about two minor episodes that those of you who know me have heard about, but those who don't know me personally have never heard about. At this point now, I should drop a note what this unlearning a language means. When I started working on Forest Ennets in the field and later Ume-Sami, both languages critically endangered or actually moribund and almost gone, there's this kind of time pressure on. You have to try to do as much as possible in a short period of time, including all the social problems, getting to know people, getting trust, finding a mutual language, finding understandings, convince people that working is a good idea, and so on. Everybody who's doing fieldwork knows this kind of procedures, which is usually not talked about. I had a kind of baggage with me, which was that I had prior skills in the major languages of the individual language branch. So this means Tundra and Ennets, which is the biggest language. I had some practical skills when going to the field, and North Sami for Ume-Sami. During the project, I unlearned those two languages. I'm no longer fluent in any of those languages. I can read texts, but if I would need to speak the language, a different language would come out of my mouth. To cut a long story short, this was futile because most important, nevertheless, was the working knowledge of Swedish and Russian as the lingua franca, as the auxiliary languages of the areas in which most of the work had to be conducted. Yeah, I went to the field somehow equipped as a linguist and as a philologist, and I have to confess that the philological perspective was futile in the long run. That's my personal experience in here. So what I'm talking today is the two instances of short-term consultant work, which took place while I was formally employed as a postdoc in Finnish studies in Helsinki. The first episode was in 2013, when I had a chance to work with the speaker of Tundra, Yukaghir. There will be a slide showing you the location in a couple of seconds. And in 2015, I had an unusual chance of working with a native speaker of Tuvan, also in Helsinki. As I said, I started this kind of thing on endangered and critically endangered moribund languages. But for the first time working with Tundra, Yukaghir, and Tuvan, I actually started working in a language without unlearning a language, because there was nothing to start with. I had structural knowledge of both languages, but I really could start from scratch, which gave me a completely different perspective on what to do and what could be done. This is just like the picture for those of you. So Tundra Yukaghir, it's an isolate spoken in the northeastern border of the Sakha Republic. And the other language, Tuvan, is here in the border area with a couple of speakers in Mongolia and then northeastern China, but most of the speakers do reside in the so-called Republic of Tuvan, which is part, a subject of the Russian Federation. So, one more piece of background information that you would need in order to understand the presentation. First of all, the major turning point in my work as a postdoc in Helsinki took place in 2014, when I was told that, yes, you have been working on your languages, you speak Finnish, Estonian, a couple of other languages, but you're not fit for a department look for a different challenge and outside phenotypic linguistics. Tundra Yukaghir work took place before this, and Tuvan took place after this. So this also gives you a kind of idea how to structure these experiences of working on those two languages from my personal background about when this happened, in which part of my career, in which circumstances, at which point of time. So let's start with the Yukaghir experience, which I have labeled, and it was really like this. Once a Yukaghir walked into my office in Helsinki. This is not the kind of standard procedure that you would expect. This Yukaghir speaker returned from a trip to Inari in northern Finland, which is not that unusual because the Inari Samis are known of having reversed language shift. And the experiences of the Inari Samis have been spread throughout the world, and there are many guests from different parts of the world that came or come regularly to Inari in order to see and hear and feel what the Inari Samis did in order to reverse language shift about 30 years ago. I met the woman on the way back when she was supposed to travel back to Russia, and her official reason to come to the department was the evergreen question whether Uralic and Yukaghir are related languages. This is something which is going through the literature once in a while. My stand is pretty obvious. Yukaghir is an isolated language which has some critical resemblances with Uralic, apparently part of early language contact, but no genetic relationship, but that's a different story. But that's what she came to the Uralic department in Helsinki in order to hear what people in the West think about her native language. I could sit with her, I could work a little bit with her for a couple of minutes, or for a couple of, let's say, but I think about 1.5 hours. She was at least to some degree literate and read a text of Yukaghir, which I had in a folklore collection around, but I couldn't work with her. This was just like talking about social linguistics, socializing, a bit of chit-chat about Russian politics and indigenous people in the Russian Federation, and that was all. We exchanged addresses and thought I would never see her again. About a month later, perhaps 1.5 months later, I'm no longer sure, she called me telling me that she's still in Finland and she will be for a longer period of time, but I want to meet her. To cut a long story short, I found out of a couple of hours later that she applied for political asylum in Finland, and got stuck in a former open prison, which served as an asylum center in eastern Finland, close to the border of Russia, in the middle of nowhere in Karelia's forests. I decided, okay, give it a chance. Let's try working with her, and that's what I did. What I knew already from our first meeting in Helsinki was that she was a semi-speaker. She grew up in Tundra Yukaghir, but her parents died rather early, and she was raised by Chukchi-speaking relatives. And she continued to use Tundra Yukaghir as a secret language with her younger brother, who also was given to the other family together with her. But with everybody else around, they spoke Chukchi, but they claimed to have been speaking Tundra Yukaghir among themselves ever since. So what we did, partly in this asylum center 3 times and once in Helsinki, in about 25 hours of incredibly intensive work, was an attempt to reawake a sleeping language, a language that has not been used in a proper surrounding for, I would say, at least 25 to 30 years. In the surrounding, a former open prison, which is certainly not the most charming and pleasing place to do field work. So, or consultant work. I use consultant work and field work in the same meaning in this presentation today. So, that's the speaker you see on the right side. Her Russian name was Tatiana, and I will refer as Tatiana to her. Yes, she was quite obvious. She was quite clear that she hasn't spoken the language for many years, that she has signs of language attrition, and things that she thought which were problematic turned out to be ungrammatical in the long run. So this concern, I could rely on her intuitions. She claimed that she had spoken the language with her brother as a kind of secret language for most of her life. which also explain, that was her explanation why most of the plural forms did no longer come out in the verbal agreement paradigm. Otherwise, there were problems in the lexicon, but strangely enough, or fortunately enough, she never mixed Chukchi and Yukaghir. She had those languages separated. So I didn't find any Chukchi borrowings which were supposed to be Tundra Yukaghir lexemes. So this part of the grammar was stable. The numeral system of Yukaghir was forgotten. That's what she claimed. So what she said this was one of the first things that she has forgotten, which is understandable because the numeral system of Yukaghir is pretty horrible. If you ever want to read about that, there are a couple of grammars around that you can consult. This is not the kind of simple decimal system that we know in Western Europe. But otherwise, the grammar was pretty stable. Also, morphology was pretty stable. So there was certainly something to be learned from this experience. And for me, it was not the first time ever that I had to work with a semi-speaker. I have worked with semi-speakers already early in Siberia, but in the case of the Yukaghir lady, I just didn't have a second speaker around. So what we could find to work on could be worked on. What she said, no chance, there was no chance. And I want to single out one particular instance in here, which was perhaps the language, the lesson I have learned from working with language. So Yukaghir is rightfully known for its complex focused conjugation system. Again, tons of articles in the grammars. You have several 50, 60 pages about that. This is a fact of the language. As soon as you talk about something, things get focused, which makes it impossible to elicitate. In a nutshell, I failed to elicitate any of the paradigms for any of the 5 focused conjugation types. It never happened. 4 of the 5 systems, the singular forms she produced, and all the forms were okay, but there was no chance to get a full paradigm for all the 5 conjugation types, focused conjugation types. So this was the first time in my life that I failed to elicit paradigms, which I have done prior to that already for 4 different languages and have been done later again. But for Yukaghir, because of the focus system, I horribly failed. And this was a lesson I could take along from the whole kind of thing. Here you get a short glimpse about how the focus system looked like. You have a so-called S focus, so subject focus, which is example 1A. What you need to look at is just like the verbal endings. The example B would be the neutral one. So my father has come, nothing is focused. So this is the kind of default. Then you have 2 transitive examples in there for object focus and the neutral focus again. And the subject focus was something that didn't show up in her examples. And as a matter of fact, also in later work with texts from published in the Russian Federation, S focus is incredibly rare all the time. So this is no surprise that these forms didn't pop up when working with a speaker who was good semi-speaker, but nothing of a full native speaker of that language. So let's switch to Tuvan, so the Turkic language of Southern Siberia. Again, also this one was unusual. I was approached during a conference on indigenous studies in Helsinki in 2014. Somebody from my department who didn't know that I had worked on Dolg and a Turkic language asked me whether I'm the person at the conference who has worked with the Turkic language, because there's a speaker of a Turkic language around who wants to meet this linguist. That was me. We met in a coffee break, had a nice chat, met for a second time a couple of days later. After 2.5 hours of a very nice conversation, I recall to these days, I asked her the typical question whether she would agree to teach me a little bit of Tuvan. I would come with the question, she wouldn't have to prepare anything. That worked out spectacularly well. Not for a number of reasons. First of all, she was for the first time a speaker my age. I have been working with speakers of the grandparental generation, so at least 20, usually 30, 40 years older than me in my lifetime. She was trained, she was literate in Tuvan and in Russian. and she was literate in Tuvan without ever having studied Tuvan philology, which is also something unusual in the Russian Federation, because most language speakers in this particular surrounding, so a language of about 200,000 native speakers, if they are professional language users, they have studied their native philology. So in this concern, she was a professional language user. She also worked for Tuvan newspapers for many years, but she hasn't studied Tuvan philology, which means that all kinds of language policies and this kind of things that these people are usually trained in, she was not aware of, which made working with her quite easy again on this. The next one was that I could work for the first time outside the documentation cycle, which means first elicit vocabulary, then work a little bit on phonetics, then go into grammar, in transitive predication, try to find somebody who wants to tell you a story, record it, find somebody else who wants to transcribe the story with you, and then doing all the kind of things going on for as long as you have time in the field or money or can return to the place. I could start from scratch on Tuvan, and which was a really nice experience, and so far in my career one of the most positive experiences, because this was a speaker of a living language, my age, literate, and with whom there simply was this kind of chemistry which made working possible. I want to give you just two examples for this one. First of all, I got the first paradigm in the very first session after 10 minutes. After the Yukaghir experience, yes, I can still do that. Second, Dolgan, even more Dolgan than Sacha, uses this kind of typical Turkic analytic verb constructions very sparsely. The very first example, so we have two examples here. The first one is in Dolgan. I have looked it up. It took me about 2 months of regular work until I got the first example. The example number B from Tuvan is the very first example phrase I elicited. So I already had the analytic predicate in the very first example, whereas for Dolgan, a related Turkic language, it took me about 2 months to get the same kind of thing. Another favorite or a favorable point was the fact that my consultant actually first studied to become a teacher of Russian, which means that she was also exposed to Russian grammar. And which means that she had a kind of basic linguistic sophistication, which I could use. For example, if you want to work on converbs, explaining what a converb is might take a while. If you just say die причастия, then the speaker of Russian knows, verbal adverbs, yeah, die причастия, okay, and no explanation required. And I could use a couple of questionnaires that I have already had in Russian, which we then just like went through to see what happened in Tuvan. These are the examples on this slide. Another very unusual experience for me in the Tuvan case was that Tuvan as a state language has different registers and a different lexicon available than highly endangered moribund languages of nomadic tundra people, reindeer pastoralists and hunters. I have once in a while tried a couple of questionnaires for fieldwork, but in many instances for Northern Siberia, I had to translate them and I had to adapt them first in order to get it doable for the speakers, because the examples in the linguistics literature are usually European, Anglo-European, but not globally applicable. And this was something which could be avoided for Tuvan because the language has this kind of lexicon available, which Umesami didn't have and Enets and Dolgan don't have. However, once in a while, context kicks in. And this is, for example, an example from Kees Hengevel's questionnaire on the internal structure of verbal clauses. The fuse blew because we had overloaded the circuit. At this point, also my Tuvan speaker said, no, we could translate this, but we get Russian throughout most of this one in here. Let's try to find a better example. And she paraphrased it for me. So the first one with a different subject, because he rode from morning to evening on horseback without rest, he got tired. That's the same language. That is the same adverbial clause type. And the other one, the fuse blew because it had become wet, which would have been easier to translate, but I decided, okay, because of overloading, the car broke. So in any case, most of the examples from Kees Hengewel's questionnaire, this particular one would have been, I would have had to translate into or adapt with different examples. But for Tuvan, I think 2 or 3 examples of the whole questionnaire had to be paraphrased. I could use the rest without any kind of preparation work, which was also a very unusual experience for me. Due to the fact that we met for 16 times, 2 hours at least, 2 hours, 2.5 hours. And I didn't have the kind of documentation linguistics circle. So vocabulary, phonetics, grammar, blah, blah, blah. We could work whatever we thought about that day. Also, she had ideas that she brought along what we could do today. So in comparison to all the other languages, I have done consultant or fieldwork so far. The Tuvan data, although it represents the idiolect of one speaker, is certainly the most complex linguistic thing that I have done. And once in a while, I have this kind of impression like, another step or another sphere of sophistication, and I could start doing generative linguistics with these kinds of very unusual color screen ideas slip furiously attempts of linguistic samples. So I think I'm down to 1 minute, Jan. Am I?
Yeah, right. I just wanted to interrupt you.
Be there in about a minute. Our relationship has changed in the meanwhile because I could help her to get into University of Helsinki in cultural anthropology, and she's currently doing her PhD on horse breeders in Tuvan, especially in her home area where she comes from. That's the southeastern area. Those from Prague know the area. This is close to Erzin. We have this story about that. And so we talk about language. I can talk to her about language on Skype, on Wire, on a couple of programs, because she has the skills of using that. Nobody of my oldies from Siberia had an own computer, had internet skills. So this means there was no chance to continue working when I left the area, and there were no younger guys around that I could use as intermediate helpers in there. But for Tuvan, I can continue and actually do continue working on the language. We had our last longer video call I think about 10 days ago, include a little bit of linguistics in there. So the last slide for today is there anything I can bring home from these 2 experiences? These are relatively short field experiences, but very intensive, both of them. First of all, Tundra Yukaghir told me information structure is even more relevant than I already assumed it to be. I just had to learn it. Second of all, everything can fail, even elicitation. Even if you have done this regularly for many years, there will be instances where you just like run against the wall and have to find different ways of getting data. Elicitation was not an option for that one. And even though this work didn't produce presumably anything new about the language, but when I started to work on already published data, it was a tremendous head start because the language was familiar. I just had to look up a couple of words, but the grammar and the language was not unknown. For Tuvan, first time ever working with a professional literate language user of my age, intensive work on almost all parts of grammar, unusual from my personal perspective, and a chance to continue to do so. something which I was not possible for the Taimyr Peninsula and might not be possible for the Umesalmi area. And this summarizes what I wanted to say. So not all languages are indeed moribund, but most of the languages I had to work on before that turned out to be moribund, and this has produced this kind of queer perspective I had on fieldwork, that a couple of elder speakers around, no longer fully fluent speakers, where I had another language along, including auxiliary language, but this didn't work out. However, when I started working from scratch without any kind of expectations and this kind of philological baggage around working fieldwork, this was a revelation. And to be honest, as the Tuvan episode started, after I was told that I should leave linguistics and should look for a new challenge, this is precisely when Tuvan popped up a couple of weeks later. So I spent the last month of my postdoc in Finnish linguistics, working on a Turkic language, looking for new challenges. And that's what I had to say for this presentation today.